There is a place in southern Oregon where the water looks less like a lake and more like a hole punched clean through the mountain into the sky. No river feeds it. No creek drains it. Every drop that fills that basin fell from a cloud. And for most of the 20th century, that fact convinced scientists of something that turned out to be almost entirely wrong. They thought the bottom was empty. They were not being careless. The logic was sound, given what they knew. But logic built on an incomplete picture can lead you to the wrong room in the house. And when researchers finally sent a machine down far enough to see for itself, what came back on the monitors did not just correct a mistake. It rewired how scientists think about where life is allowed to exist on this planet and possibly on several others. To understand what the cameras found, you first have to understand what broke to create the space they were exploring. Around 7,700 years ago, a stratovolcano known as Mount Mazama dominated the skyline of what is now the Southern Cascades. It stood taller than the peak that replaced it, capped in ice, visible for miles in every direction. Then its magma chamber emptied itself in one of the largest eruptions North America has seen in the last 10,000 years. Ash from that event has been traced across the Pacific Northwest and into Canada, forming a layer geologists still use as a chronological marker when dating other sites. But the eruption itself is not the strange part. What happened next is, with the chamber beneath it hollowed out, the mountain's summit had nothing left to stand on. Roughly a mile of rock did not blow away. It fell in, collapsing into the emptied magma reservoir and leaving behind a caldera nearly 6 miles across. For a while, that basin was simply a smoking wound in the landscape. Ash, cooling stone, no water at all. Then it began slowly to fill. With no permanent inlet or outlet, the caldera collects almost nothing but rain and snowmelt. Over centuries, that accumulation produced a lake reaching close to 1,950 feet at its deepest point, the deepest lake in the United States, and among the deepest in the world. Because so little sediment, runoff, or organic debris ever reaches it, the water is remarkably free of the particles that usually cloud a lake. That is why Crater Lake earns its reputation for extraordinary clarity and its saturated, almost artificial-looking blue. Purity, though, is a double-edged trait in biology. A lake this clean is also a lake with almost nothing to eat. For decades, the working theory among limnologists was straightforward. Crater Lake is severely oligotrophic, meaning it is starved of the nutrients that typically fuel aquatic food webs. Streams elsewhere carry in decaying leaves, animal waste, and mineral runoff that feed everything from algae to fish. Crater Lake has essentially none of that supply chain. Near the surface, enough sunlight penetrates the water for a modest population of introduced fish and plankton to survive. But the deep basin, sitting under crushing pressure in water that hovers barely above freezing year-round, seemed to have no plausible energy source at all. The prevailing assumption was that the floor of the lake was close to sterile, a stretch of bare volcanic sediment too cold, too dark, and too poor in nutrients to support meaningful life. Reaching that floor to check the assumption directly was, for most of the lake's studied history, simply not possible. Human divers cannot survive at those depths and temperatures for any useful length of time. So researchers turned to remote and crude submersibles instead. The pivotal work came in the late 1980s, when oceanographers Jack Diamond and Robert Collier of Oregon State University's College of Oceanography led a series of dives using a one-person research submersible called Deep Rover. Over multiple field seasons, the team made dozens of dives into the deep basin, mapping the floor and sampling water chemistry in places no instrument had reliably reached before. What they found did not match the biological desert prediction. Scattered across sections of the lake floor, the submersible's lights picked out sprawling colonies of bacteria, dense, fibrous mats with a distinctive rust and amber coloring, some patches spanning tens of feet across. According to contemporary reporting on the expedition, one mat measured roughly 60 feet in extent. These were not small or incidental colonies. They were substantial biological structures thriving in a place that, by the standing model of a lake's ecology, should have offered them nothing to live on. Closer inspection showed the bacteria were clustered specifically around and downstream of pools and vents where the surrounding water ran slightly warmer than the rest of the lake, sometimes, researchers found, by nearly 11 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient. Two major sites of this activity were later named Leo's Bath in the South Central Basin and the Palisades Point Pools in the Northeast Basin. Around both, the team measured elevated concentrations of dissolved iron, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and other minerals uncharacteristic of ordinary lake water. The conclusion, published by Diamond, Collier, and colleagues in the journal Nature in 1989, was that these bacterial communities were deriving their energy not from sunlight, but from the oxidation of ferrous iron seeping up from below, and that the mats themselves were acting as visible markers of diffuse hydrothermal venting on the lake floor. In other words, the volcano that built the caldera in the first place had never fully gone quiet. Heat and mineral-rich fluid were still leaking upward from the remnants of Mazamis' old plumbing, and life at the bottom of the lake had found a way to run on that chemistry instead of daylight. The mechanism at work here is called chemosynthesis, and inverts the rule most people learn in a basic biology class. Nearly every food chain on the surface of the earth ultimately traces back to sunlight. Plants and algae convert light into chemical energy, and everything else in the chain either eats them or eats something that did. In the total darkness of Crater Lake's deep basin, that chain has no starting point. Sunlight simply never arrives. Chemosynthetic bacteria solve the problem by extracting usable energy from chemical reactions instead. In this case, iron-oxidizing organisms strip electrons from dissolved ferrous iron rising through the hydrothermal seeps, using the energy released to build biomass. It is a slower, quieter process than photosynthesis, but it works. And at the seep sites, it works well enough to produce mats large enough to be filmed from a submersible cockpit. This is the same basic biological trick that stunned oceanographers when they first found it at deep-sea hydrothermal vents in the late 1970s, in places like the Galapagos Rift, thousands of feet below the ocean surface, far beyond any reach of sunlight. Finding a freshwater version of the same phenomenon in a mountain lake in Oregon, a lake with a paved scenic road around its rim and roughly 500,000 annual visitors, was, for the researchers involved, a genuine surprise. It suggested that the conditions required for chemosynthetic ecosystems are less exotic and less confined to the deep ocean than scientists had previously assumed. A follow-up genetic study published in Frontiers in Microbiology in 2022 examined samples from those same mat communities using rRNA gene sequencing. That research identified a surprisingly diverse bacterial community sustained by the hydrothermal fluids, with iron oxidation driven largely by bacteria in the genera Gallionella and Mariprofundus, and additional sulfur-oxidizing contributions from other microbial groups. The 2022 team concluded that hydrothermal input is likely essential to primary productivity in this part of the lake, the deep water equivalent of sunlight for a system that will never see any. Among the odder features documented at the bottom of Crater Lake are the so-called blue pools, dense, mineral-saturated bodies of water sitting in depressions on the lake floor, distinct enough in salinity and temperature that they resist mixing with the fresh water surrounding them. Contemporary accounts from the Deep Rover dives describe pools ranging up to roughly 25 feet across, with their own visible surfaces and boundaries, like small chemically distinct lakes nested inside the larger one. Researchers at the time proposed that these pools were fed by hydrothermal fluid seeping up through fractures in the caldera floor, dense enough and different enough in composition to pool in low spots rather than dispersing immediately into the main body of the lake. Around their margins, the same kind of iron-oxidizing bacterial mats tended to concentrate, apparently drawing on the nutrient-rich water at the interface between the pool and the surrounding lake. The existence of hydrothermal features at all was, notably, a matter of real scientific debate for a period in the late 1980s. A peer review panel was convened to weigh evidence for hydrothermal venting against a competing explanation, that warmer, mineral-laden groundwater might instead be entering the lake's south basin through a landslide zone along the caldera wall, rather than rising directly from volcanic sources beneath the floor. The debate mattered beyond pure curiosity. At the time, there was active interest in geothermal energy development near the park, and questions about whether drilling nearby could affect the lake's water chemistry and famous clarity. The weight of subsequent chemical and thermal evidence, including anomalously high concentrations of helium-3, a gas associated with mantle-derived volcanic sources, supported the hydrothermal explanation, reinforcing that the volcano beneath the lake, while dormant on the surface, is still chemically and thermally active well below it. That ongoing geothermal activity also helps explain a smaller mystery that had puzzled visitors for generations. The Cascade Range around Crater Lake receives enormous winter snowfall. The caldera rim regularly sees several dozen feet accumulate over a season. Yet the lake itself almost never freezes over completely. A thin skin of ice in the harshest years is considered notable enough to make local news. Part of the explanation is simple thermal inertia. A body of water nearly 2,000 feet deep holds an enormous amount of heat and loses it very slowly compared to a shallow pond. But researchers studying the hydrothermal system have also pointed to a secondary contributor, the slow, continuous release of geothermal heat from the lake floor, which adds a small but steady input of warmth to the deep water column, gradually working its way upward. The mountain that destroyed itself in a single violent afternoon roughly 7,700 years ago is, in a much quieter and more literal sense, still warming the lake that now fills the crater it left behind. Not every feature of Crater Lake worth mentioning came from a submersible. One of its most enduring oddities has been visible on the surface the entire time. Locals and park rangers call it the Old Man of the Lake, a full hemlock log, bleach pale, that floats upright rather than lying flat, its weathered top rising several feet above the waterline, while its waterlogged root end hangs down into the cold. Floating logs typically become saturated and roll onto their side within a few years, eventually sinking. This one has been documented in various written accounts, floating vertically for well over a century, drifting across different parts of the caldera depending on wind and current, without any apparent pattern. The likeliest explanation ties back to the same purity that defines the rest of the lake. The cold, nutrient-poor, biologically sparse water appears to slow the decomposition processes that would normally waterlog and destabilize a log of that size, allowing it to remain buoyant and upright far longer than would be expected almost anywhere else. It is, in effect, a slow-motion illustration of the same principle that keeps the lake's deep sediment layers so undisturbed. Very little happens quickly at the bottom of this particular caldera. That stillness turns out to matter for an entirely different kind of research. Because Crater Lake's deep basin has no current strong enough to disturb the floor, sediment that settles there tends to stay exactly where it lands, building up in distinct, undisturbed layers over thousands of years. Sediment cores drilled from the lake bed function as a kind of chronological record, with ash layers marking major volcanic events and finer sediment marking quieter intervals in between. That sediment record aligns closely with oral traditions maintained by the Klamath tribes, whose ancestors lived in the region at the time of Mazama's collapse, and whose accounts of the event have been passed down across generations. Those traditions describe a great conflict tied to the destruction of the mountain and the subsequent formation of the water-filled basin. Researchers and tribal historians have noted the striking correspondence between the sequence of events preserved in oral tradition and the sequence reconstructed independently from the geological and sedimentary record. A rare case in which a community's inherited memory of a specific ancient event lines up closely with physical, datable evidence for that same event, spanning a gap of well over 7,000 years. Crater Lake's deep ecosystem is not a static museum piece, however. Signal crayfish, a species not native to the lake, were introduced into the shallower margins decades ago and have been expanding their range along the shoreline ever since. Ecological monitoring by the National Park Service and academic researchers has tracked this spread over time, and it has been linked to sharp declines in native invertebrates and in a small range-restricted amphibian species found in the lake, the Mazama newt, which appears to have limited natural defenses against a fast-breeding, opportunistic predator it never evolved alongside. Cold water and depth appear to be the main limiting factors, slowing the crayfish's advance into deeper zones, rather than any resistance from the native community itself, which raises ongoing concern among researchers about the long-term trajectory of the lake's shallow water ecology. The broader significance of Crater Lake's hydrothermal ecosystem extends, well, beyond limnology. Scientists studying the potential for life on icy moons, such as Jupiter's Europa and Saturn's Enceladus, have long focused on a similar structural puzzle. Both moons are thought to host liquid water oceans beneath thick ice shells, kept from freezing solid not by sunlight, which barely reaches that far from the sun, but by internal heat generated through tidal flexing and radioactive decay. If life exists in those oceans, it would almost certainly have to rely on chemical energy sources rather than photosynthesis, in conditions with clear parallels to what researchers found at the bottom of Crater Lake. A cold, dark, pressurized, sunlight-free body of water, kept partially warm by internal heat, hosting microbial communities that draw their entire energy budget from mineral chemistry rather than daylight. That parallel has made Crater Lake a useful terrestrial reference point for astrobiologists and planetary scientists thinking through what to look for and how to recognize it. If and when a future mission manages to drill through the ice of a distant moon and lower an instrument into the ocean beneath. The story of Crater Lake's floor is, in the end, a story about the limits of inference. Decades of careful reasoning. No inlet, no outlet, minimal nutrient supply, therefore minimal life. Turned out to describe the surface conditions of a lake accurately, while missing an entire hidden energy source running beneath it. It took physically sending cameras and instruments into a place no one could otherwise reach to correct the picture. What they found was not a random curiosity. It was a self-contained, still active hydrothermal ecosystem, chemically fed rather than sunlight fed, sitting inside a U.S. national park, largely unknown to the millions of people who have stood on the rim and admired the color of the water without any idea what was happening nearly 2,000 feet below their feet. It is a useful reminder that some of the most genuinely alien environments on Earth are not hidden in remote oceans or polar ice sheets. Sometimes they are sitting quietly under a lake most people think they already understand, waiting for someone to lower a light down far enough to look.